I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we have a full show for you today, as we often do. Our topics today, Ben is going to talk about Confucius Institutes and whether any of the measures taken against them in college universities are actually working, whether they're actually disappearing. Josh is going to be talking about President Biden's Middle East trip and whether or not that was successful. I'm going to be talking about how UPenn has named Leah Thomas Female Athlete of the Year, and the NCAA is looking at doing the same thing. And Emily is going to talk about how Starbucks is blaming woke officials for store closures in dangerous cities. So Ben, do you want to kick us off here with the Confucius Institute topic?
Sure, and I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers are familiar with Confucius Institutes, but essentially these were supposedly Chinese U.S. institution cultural exchange centers that started to crop up primarily in colleges and universities, starting in around 2005. And moving fast forwarding about a decade, the National Association of Scholars put together an unbelievable report investigating the activities of these purported Chinese U.S. cultural exchange centers. And what they found was that at many Confucius Institutes, there was essentially Chinese Communist Party regime propaganda that was being put forth within these centers. So while there might be, sort of traditional, art and other common cultural practices from China that were being taught to U.S. students, sometimes, by the way, for course credit, to the extent anyone wanted to talk about Tiananmen Square or Tibet or Xinjiang, basically there would be radio silence. We also understood, based upon NASA's findings, that those participating in the programs oftentimes were afraid to broach these subjects, and that potentially there were a whole raft of other compromising elements to these centers, in no small part because they were overseen, funded, staffed by, had textbooks that were all approved by the Hanban, which is an entity within China's Ministry of Education. It's a propaganda ministry, of course. So you had U.S. institutions taking money from a Chinese Communist Party propaganda entity, which was controlling the content of these courses, obviously had substantial leverage with the dollars that were involved. And this is not even to mention, of course, the potential espionage aspects of this, either informing on or spying on those Chinese nationals studying in America, or, of course, there's the potential for trying to convert or create assets of Americans as well. And so NASA's report, the National Association of Scholars' report, which came out in 2017, tipped off, in my view, a huge press among law enforcement, members of Congress as well, to start digging into China's infiltration more broadly of America's education system and exploitation of our academic freedom, and using it to put forth potentially the priorities of the regime in ways that threaten national security or could threaten national security. And so this became highly publicized. China's Confucius Institutes, I think it became well understood that these could be Trojan centers for influence, infiltration, penetration, espionage. And in my view, this really illustrated well the modus operandi for the Chinese Communist Party to exploit our institutions. And so ultimately, with a massive uproar, law enforcement briefing all of these educational institutions, it appeared that there was a massive shuttering of these centers. And also, the NDAA military bill, defense bill rather, also had provisions put in place which would essentially cease funding, military funding in particular, DoD funding, to those institutions that continued to house Confucius Institute. So all of these measures led to what appeared to be a whole raft of closures. And at their peak, there were 118 Confucius Institutes on college campuses, and 104 of them either closed or were in the process of closing. But as NASA's disclosed in a new report that came out last month, they could not cite one center that actually fully closed, in the sense of no more Chinese U.S. cross-cultural exchange centers, no more funding from China, no more direction from communist entities. In fact, and this is kind of the money quote from the whole report, in no cases are we sufficiently confident to classify any university as having fully closed its Confucius Institutes. Of the 4 case studies that they ran, there was evidence of continued collaboration with the Chinese government in all of them. Overall, we find the Chinese government has carefully courted American colleges and universities, seeking to persuade them to keep their Confucius Institutes, or failing that, to reopen similar programs under other names. American colleges and universities, too, appear eager to replace their Confucius Institutes with other forms of engagement with China, frequently in ways that mimic the major problems with these institutes. So this report demonstrates the shape-shifting way in which China has operated here. Also, from my perspective, demoralizingly shows that most of these universities did not shutter these centers and then resurrect them out of fears over Communist Party's malign influence here, but rather to kind of get in line with the law. And then to open up new centers was the primary rationale they used. So I think this is an indictment of our college campuses, but also I think it demonstrates the fact that only with serious legislative effort will our civil society institutions ultimately purge themselves of Chinese Communist Party influence. And I'm curious for the group, what do you think about kind of the questions that arise here about so-called academic freedom, of course, from institutions that don't really care for academic freedom, but the exploitation by malign powers of these institutions and what it represents more broadly in terms of American society's effort to grapple with the comprehensive CCP threat?
Well, first of all, this is not just in universities. It's really important to realize there is a similar effort happening in K-12, where there is no academic freedom. So that's clearly not the objection. I also think it's a really good example of the shape of sort of the U.S. relationship with China in 2 important respects. First is that, of course, at least in the abstract sense, I'm reluctant to call universities part of our free society, but at least in the abstract sense, right? It's taking advantage of the structures that allow for a free society in a way that most other countries would not even think about allowing a hostile foreign power to do. And the second thing, of course, is the split between our elites and the rest of Americans, right? If there has been one thing that Americans have kind of come together on over the last, let's say, 5-6 years, it has been understanding that China is our enemy. And yet our elites are still, whether that's in the universities or in large corporations, are still kind of selling the family jewels. They're pretending that China is a normal market actor. So these kinds of programs exist, these cultural exchange programs, all this stuff exists for, it exists for Spain, it exists for France, it exists for Australia, right? But there's this reluctance to make a distinction, particularly when there's plenty of money involved, to make a distinction between a country that is hostile to us and teaching their propaganda to US students. The other, just one really brief point I want to make, oftentimes the consulate is in communication with a lot of these groups. So not just the Confucius Institutes, but the Chinese Student Union, for example. And again, this is one of those things where this is America. We're totally fine with, of course, like Americans of different ethnic background having, for example, cultural groups on campus. But oftentimes those cultural groups have direct contact with the consulate. In fact, that's what happened in my university, that the consulate was giving orders to half foreign exchange students, but also they feel they own like Han Chinese Americans as well. And so they are, the consulates are giving orders to American citizens who are oftentimes afraid if they have, especially to have family back in China. Like, so this is a real, they are exerting influence, not just in universities, but in K-12 and in a broader sense. And I'm sure Emily might touch on this, but in a broader sense by using their market power, whether it's Hollywood or, the NBA or a bunch of other institutions. So there's a real split between, I think, the American people and the elites on this, as there is with many things.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the extent of China's infiltration of our system of higher education is not totally well understood, and Ben's breakdown of this report from 2017 I think is really helpful. And then to look back and say, this should be bipartisan. This is not a partisan question. This should be a bipartisan effort to shut this stuff down. The federal government can do that, should do that, and the fact that that's not immediately happening, despite how obvious and honestly fairly easy it would be, is really telling. And I don't want to give them too much credit it because I'm not sure how well this propaganda is working anymore. I do think there's been sort of an awakening. Just really quickly, I think we talked earlier this year about my alma mater, GW, where, to Inez's point, students who were in touch with the embassy and the consulate protested they had included the work of an artist that was sort of anti-CCP, Chinese artist who was anti-CCP. The Chinese Student Union freaked out, and probably had been in touch with the consulate and the embassy, and it didn't work. It worked at first, and then people said, "Wait, this is America. We have free speech here." And I think a few years ago, it probably would have worked. Period. So maybe their propaganda is too weak to survive at this point, and I hope that's the case.
So I'll be brief here because I basically echo what's been said. I guess the only other things I'll add is sometimes in general, I just wonder why the left is so up in arms about Russia all the time, obviously going back to the 2016 election and the infamous disinformation and the Facebook and Putin and all of that. And they just really just don't seem to give a what at best about China. At worst, they tend to mollycoddle, they tend to downplay, obviously, the Wuhan origins of the virus. Ben has also written about this quite extensively for me in Newsweek as well. I really do think it kind of boils down to the fact that Russia is quote unquote white and quote unquote Christian and China is not. Part of me, if I'm just being overly cynical, it would not be the first time that I've been accused of being overly cynical, but I think that in many ways really does kind of just boil down to that. But another thing that I think would be good fodder for future conversation, kind of going back to kind of like Inez's wheelhouse, is what should we do about the intersection of Chinese students, really, and Chinese just broader academic educational influence and the American higher education, the American academy in general? So Amanda Rothschild, if I recall, had a good op-ed for us maybe last year or so, sometime in 2021. If I recall, she basically called for a severe limitation, potentially like an outright moratorium on allowing people from actual China to study in US universities, because one of two things has to happen. Either we have to kind of change our visa system to try to like get these people here. That's kind of the more libertarian kind of open borders argument, like just get the foreign talent here, let them work in Silicon Valley, H-1B visas, blah, blah, blah. But if we're not going to do that, and we're just going to get these people in credentialed and then ship them back overseas to a hostile regime, the Chinese, what is the point here? So something has to give. And we're not going to answer these questions in this segment, but I think it is good fodder for future conversation, certainly. But we're out of time on this segment, so let's transition. I guess we'll stay within the realm of foreign policy here. So Joe Biden has completed his Middle East trip. He has been in Israel, in Eastern Jerusalem. What the media will tell you is the so-called West Bank, East Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. And then, of course, he famously, perhaps the most kind of headline-grabbing part of this trip, of course, was his infamous fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman, the reform-minded Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So I'm certainly not going to join the Washington Post-led chorus of outrage about this fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman. Ben and I have discussed the Jamal Khashoggi affair on this show before, which really kind of amounts to a Qatari information operation trying to warp America, really trying to get the Obama Biden-centric foreign policy people to realign America's interests away from the Saudis, away from the Egyptians, towards the Iranians. So I'm not going to join that chorus of criticism, but it does seem that in many ways, a lot that happened on this trip, as I see it, really does accentuate a lot of the clear and very obvious failings of this total clown show of an administration. So Biden basically touched down at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv last week. We're recording this on Monday, so I think he touched down on Wednesday, if I recall. There's literally video of this. So he gets off the plane and he turns to an aide and says, "What am I doing now?" Within minutes, he then goes to a microphone, and he's joined by Yair Lapid, who has recently supplanted Naftali Bennett as the acting prime minister before Israel's fifth round of elections in 3 years happens later this year. And next to Yair Lapid, he speaks of the quote unquote truth and honor of the Holocaust. Maybe like 20 years ago, it might have been like, oh, Uncle Joe, like casual slip of the tongue. But, there's like a large enough sample size now where this is like a pretty heavy, yet another indication of this man is just like clearly like not right on the head. So later that trip, after he met with Yair Lapid, he met with Isaac Herzog, the president. So then he goes to Eastern Jerusalem. They take off the Israeli flag from the presidential motorcade just to travel like the 2 to 3 miles, whatever it is, from Western Jerusalem to Eastern Jerusalem, where, of course, he meets with Holocaust denialist Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority. And he makes this really vile and grotesque comparison where he basically goes, oh, my family's Irish Catholic. I'm very familiar with the way that like those icky kind of Protestant British have historically treated the Irish Catholics. So I'm very familiar with your plight, how all those kind of like icky Jews in Israel treat you guys here in quote unquote Palestine. Really just vile, noxious stuff. The Biden administration has gone above and beyond to try to fund the Palestinian Authority to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in clear violation of the spirit, if not perhaps quite the exacting lawyerly letter of the Taylor Force Act. There's a very good argument that they are actually directly violating the statute, but at a bare minimum, they are clearly violating the spirit of this 2018 bipartisan law, the Taylor Force Act, which basically put a kibosh on U.S. subsidies to the Palestinian Authority until they stop with this pay for slave program where they pay the families of jihadists who kill Israelis and Americans for that matter, because Taylor Force was an American. So then finally he goes to Saudi Arabia, and it seems to me that he didn't accomplish what he set out to do in Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not entirely sure I fully understand exactly what he was trying to do, but it seems like the most obvious thing he was trying to do was get a firm commitment to boost oil production, given obviously 4-decade high gasoline prices, inflation, all of that we've discussed on the show ad infinitum. He didn't get that. At best, he got like a very kind of tacit, limp, kind of flaccid, like say like, oh, we'll put it on the agenda, we'll consider it. The broader thing, of course, is this idea that the Saudis really ideally should be brought into the Abraham Accords, should be brought into this generational peace agreements that Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu oversaw, where Israel made formal peace with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. The Saudis clearly signed off on that. There was no way that Abu Dhabi and Bahrain would have signed onto that without the Saudis' blessing. So the only question here is whether the Saudis can formally be brought into that. It does not seem to me like they have made any substantial progress on that front. The obvious reason for that is because the Biden administration continues to try to appease the Saudis' arch foe, the Iranian regime, in these ridiculous negotiations in Vienna that are clearly going nowhere. So from my perspective, this trip did not go particularly well. To put it mildly, but I'm kind of just curious for your guys' thoughts, whether you agree with my take on this.
This trip was a disaster. It was embarrassing. And it's exactly why first of all, it's why you don't have a senile president. You don't elect a senile president. You don't put him through the primary, enable him. And then, this is on Jill Biden, who encouraged this, the Biden family who encouraged this. And that might sound ridiculous and trivial, but in all sincerity, this man does not have the capacity to perform as a leader of the free world, let alone as a leader of our country. And to go on the international stage to beg Saudi Arabia for oil unsuccessfully and have them leak things that are contrary to your story to the American public, that makes us look like we just begged and were rebuked by a less powerful country against the interests of our people. It is just utterly humiliating. And it is a reason why the Democratic Party that nominated Joe Biden, because none of the other candidates understood what their voters actually wanted, it is a shame. And it was humiliating as an American, like partisanship aside, it was just humiliating as an American to watch the way that his senility was treated by other countries, and they know how to do it now.
So I'll be really brief here. On both the optics and the substance, this was a joke and a disaster. The interesting thing was that this trip was portrayed as sort of a way to get out of Washington, D.C. and turn the page on the domestic disasters unfolding. And he walked into several foreign policy disasters from the perspective of America's national interest. Maybe the Biden people think this trip was a success. But first of all, obviously, I'd say kind of twofold. On the one hand, this showed the way in which the Biden administration squandered what the Trump administration had achieved. Of course, Joe Biden said he wanted to make MBS in Saudi Arabia a pariah. This shows you precisely how foolish and farcical that was. leaving aside, of course, that Joe Biden and his family have no problem doing business with all manner of authoritarian regimes around the world. It was obviously not in America's national interest to go about chiding and chastising and attacking a Saudi Arabian regime that is critical as a bulwark against the Iranians, regardless of the fact that obviously we wouldn't want to live under Saudi royal family decree ourselves. So this was obviously a failure, and that Saudi Arabia told him to go pound sand. And of course, that's how any rational leadership would act in response to an administration coming hand in hand after attacking MBS and then basically begging for oil, of course, because we needlessly have constrained and curtailed our own supply and went from energy independence to dependence within a year and a half or less. So obviously embarrassing there. But I do think it also shows the durability of what Trump achieved in the region, because, of course, the administration tried to tout the fact that Joe Biden flying from Israel to Saudi Arabia represented a landmark achievement in terms of the normalization to some extent, even if not formally, between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Of course, that's all thanks to the Trump administration's efforts, has nothing to do with what the Biden administration has done. And he tried to pass off, the fostering of relations between the Gulf Arab powers and Israel, as well as being an achievement of the administration. But at by the same token, of course, they're still trying to go down this road of an Iran nuclear deal 2.0. And still, to Josh's point, in the coddling of the Palestinian Arab leadership and trying to essentially undercut the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem with his visits. The fact that he can't really achieve anything lasting there, I think, does show the durability of what transpired over the last 4 years. And thank God, that's hugely beneficial to America's national interest. But it doesn't mean this administration won't do everything it possibly can to reprise an ascendant Muslim Brotherhood and Iranian axis in the region, because that was always the Obama-Biden and now the Biden administration's goal, to make the strong course the Islamists, both Sunni and Shia, in the Middle East and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Obama, yes, this reminds me of the Obama foreign policy in more ways than one. Obviously, I'm not like Josh or Ben in terms of being a foreign policy expert, but from the top level perspective, it's kind of the worst of all worlds scenario. You can talk about realpolitik and making our foreign policy decisions purely on national interest. You can talk about the fact that America is great because it is good, and we need to be we need to make our foreign policy consonant with our domestic values. That would be something like Carter, right, which was in his own way a disaster, but at least was trying to sort of align America's foreign policy with domestic morality. It seems like with the Obama administration and then now the Biden administration, it's the worst of both worlds, right? It is this bizarre thing where we are constantly forming foreign policy around essentially domestic morality, but only in the cases where it hurts the United States, right? We don't care at all about the many human rights violations of America's enemies. We only care about the human rights violations in cases where there are regimes that actually could work well with the United States on some national priority goals. So that seems completely backwards. And just generally, it seems like our policy is the reverse of Teddy Roosevelt. It's more like, yell very loudly and condescendingly about human rights violations, but carry a very tiny twig, not a big stick. And that truly is the worst of all worlds, right? Like I could imagine a consistent US foreign policy that took either one of those tacks and had better results than this kind of a little bit from column A and a little bit of column B in the worst possible combination for the American people. So with that, I'm going to transition to my own topic here, and that is that the University of Pennsylvania has decided to slap all of its female athletes in the face and nominate Leah Thomas as female national woman of the year for the NCAA, right? So we have a man who has been nominated as the NCAA's Woman of the Year award for the University of Pennsylvania. Important to note, this is obviously not just about swimming. So they literally could have chosen any other female athlete, actual woman athlete for this award. And obviously this is not important in the large scheme of things, this particular award, but it does show once again that functionally, in our elite institutions and increasingly under our law, there is no distinction between male and female, between man and woman. Our definitions that we have been working with for millennia are no longer the ones accepted by our elite institutions. And I was just over this past weekend promoting something that IWF and IWV do, which is this Women's Bill of Rights, which does not add any like new rights to all it does is define. It defines woman, it defines man for the purposes of federal or state law, depending on who would pick it up. And this shows again why this is so necessary, because there are multi-pronged attacks on the definition of sex. And it turns out that really matters under the law. It turns out there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of instances in which women and men rely on every day for that the law actually recognize the reality of biological sex, from TSA pat downs of the same sex to incarceration, where we just had an incident in New Jersey where, of course, the way they said it is transgender woman impregnates two other inmates. Yeah, women can't impregnate anything, right? You put a biological man into a prison with women, and there were natural consequences from that. From the TSA and prisons to sports teams like this Leah Thomas incident, sports teams and universities and K-12 locker rooms. There are literally, like I said, hundreds of instances, that some of which we don't even think about, where the law recognizes the definition of sex. And this is just another indication that defining that in the law proactively is incredibly necessary in the face of not only attempts like the Equality Act and the ERA as a constitutional amendment to erase those distinctions, but also completely bureaucratic attempts, right? Administrative attempts, which is what these Title IX regulations from the Biden administration do the same thing. So it's really important that we proactively define sex in the law, both on the state and federal level, and potentially some conflicts with these overreaching bureaucrats. And basically that would affect something like UPenn that takes a lot of state money. So with that, I'll throw it out. I guess the questions for the group would be, how do we go about proactively dealing with this? Obviously, I think all four of us, and probably, I hope everyone listening to this podcast, understands that the distinction between male and female is one of the most foundational in civilization, and that these sort of lies in our culture can't endure. So how should we go about and I guess how should we go about this fight? And also whether you think this fight should be sort of central or periphery, because when we're talking about MBS and we're talking about America's foreign policy and all of that, I mean, these things can seem a little trivial, but my argument is I really don't think they are trivial. So I'll toss it out to everyone else.
We know how non-trivial they are by the fact that our hostile foreign powers are trying to undercut us by exploiting these absurd, decadent divisions. We know that that's what they do on social media. We know, for instance, that Russia saw this as a huge vulnerability when they were, implementing their social media campaign to divide Americans in 2016, and we saw this. So it's absolutely it's absolutely a central question. It's as important as any other question. It's not just an abstract discussion about the fringes of the left, just precisely because, and as this example you highlight shows, this is a major, this is a storied, prestigious major institution giving an award that belongs to an actual woman to a man, and that shows exactly how powerful this is and exactly why it is no longer this abstract sort of conversation about the fringe left, and it never should have been treated as an abstract conversation about the fringe left, but it's completely essential. And I think to your question, we should be proactive about it. I love the Bill of Rights idea, and you think that's kind of silly because Title IX itself said on the basis of sex, and there was never this idea that we would have to define sex. Even if you go back to how Phyllis Schlafly was talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, everybody understood that there were sexual differences, and so I think yes, be proactive, talk about what these differences are and why they matter. There are some that are small that are very obvious, things like breastfeeding. Talk about that, talk about the value in that. It's sort of sad that we have to, but maybe also an opportunity. the other hand, the left is doing a huge part of our job for us just by doing things exactly like this that offend the sensibilities of just about everybody except for 10% of the country. So they're doing a bang up job.
Can I ask a question out of curiosity, and then I'll do my segment? Have any of the three of you seen Matt Walsh's "What Is Woman" documentary?
Yes.
Okay. I just watched it this past weekend for the first time. I used to work at the Daily Wire, of course. I used to edit Matt's column most days. I love Matt. I think he's not just like amazingly good at what he does, but like a really like just genuinely fun person to hang out with. His documentary was excellent. I would really recommend it to the listeners and the viewers of this program. And what I think is so effective about the Walsh "What Is a Woman" documentary is there's just a series of these conversations and these interviews where he sits down with these, purportedly well-credentialed people, whether they're surgeons who are involved in chemical castration, whether they're pediatricians assigning like puberty blocking drugs, whether they're gender LGBT studies, whatever professors deep in the bowels of the American Academy. And he just exposes their absolute lunacy, like how completely morally and logically insane these people are. Like they literally are the documentary shows how they are incapable of defining what is a woman without resorting to what Walsh correctly points out is circular logic. Like a woman, according apparently to the avant-garde in gender and women's studies, is someone who self-identifies as a woman. To which the obvious response is anyone who ever took, trained for the LSAT or took formal logic is, well, that's circular reasoning. That is by like, what are you identifying as? And by the end of this hour-and-a-half documentary, Matt Walsh has not gotten an answer to this very obvious question. So I think the reason I'm kind of focusing, my remarks here on this Walsh documentary is because I think that tactic, whether it comes from documentary filmmakers, whether it comes from Project Veritas, whether it comes from kind of organization like that, is the way that we ultimately, I think, kind of win this fight, or even when it comes to kind of like that exchange we talked about, in the last episode between Josh Hawley and that backcrap crazy Cal Berkeley law professor, is we just have to shine a spotlight, I think, on how removed from reality, how removed from kind of the basic sensibilities of the median American these people are. Because when you cannot define what a woman is beyond saying someone who self-identifies as a woman, I mean, I have to think the median American looks at that and says, this is crazy. I know what a woman is. It is someone who has XYZ physical characteristics, period, full stop, end of story. So, look, what's happening here at UPenn is like, it is egregious. Walsh does a whole segment on the UPenn Leah Thomas thing in the documentary. They kind of have someone, he interviews a swimmer on the team. They have to kind of black out the swimmer's face because she's like too afraid of reprisal to kind of have her face there, which says it all. This is a mafia. It is an oppressive cultural rainbow flag, transgender jihad. And the way that we ultimately kind of win this fight against the cultural jihadis is just to shine a very bright spotlight on their lunacy, I think.
Yeah, I think that demonstrating in crystal clear fashion the ridiculousness and the absurdity of this is definitely part of the right approach. I think this is why libs of TikTok had to be doxxed and attacked, precisely because all libs of TikTok did was hold up a mirror to the fact that this is what the most rabid and radical leftists believe. And while they may be fringe, their influence goes far beyond their number, which is the problem when you have all of our institutions controlled by those who are at least adjacent to these individuals, as well represented in our institutions of higher learning that are then going to populate the bureaucracy and our cultural centers of influence and our corporations and beyond, which makes it so that the craziest ideas end up looking far more representative than they actually are in our society. But I think at core, beyond the fact that the radical gender ideology is essentially anti-civilizational because it goes against nature quite literally, as demonstrated, of course, as we saw, first with Ketanji Brown Jackson not being able to, or not being willing to define what a woman is, and then in this testimony with Senator Hawley and the professor unable to say that only women can get pregnant. This is the war on women, first of all, because it is denying the uniqueness of women, which should be celebrated, and that the left was supposed to be about protecting. But I think at core, beyond the civilizational aspects of this, it's about trying to make people submit to a lie, to reject what they know to be true from the time we're small children. And I think that is ultimately their agenda, which demands total control, which requires total control, requires us to acquiesce to and accept and submit to and keep our mouths shut about lies that we know to be lies. And so it's important to speak truth and to confront this with truth and courage going forward, because submitting to a lie means you can submit to their entire agenda. And we can't have that in this country. We're not a free country if we do.
So
oh, Emily, go ahead.
no, I was going to transition.
Oh, that's what I was going to do. I was going to kick it over to you. I was
No pun intended.
that Ben, I think, is completely right about how if you can force people to watch Leo Thomas get a female athlete award and say nothing, you really can force people to say and think anything. But with that, we will kick it over to Emily. She's going to talk about some Starbucks closing, which and Starbucks giving some very interesting reasons for why that's happening.
Well, speaking of our rotting and decadent institutions, one of America's biggest companies, something that is in everyone's neighborhood at least once, if not much more than that, Starbucks, is walking back its policies. And Howard Schultz, who returned to lead the company in April, founder of Starbucks, after flirting with a presidential run, an ill-fated presidential run, is back, and he's talking about how he believes that America's cities are failing to address the homelessness crisis, to address the mental health crisis. And this is why he says Starbucks is closing some stores in major American cities and big spots in major American cities. So to be clear here, this is saying that our American cities cannot sustain one of our biggest American coffee franchises because crime and mental illness and homelessness is out of control. Now, there's another layer to the story, which is that Howard Schultz has also said that Starbucks is going to, quote, need to rethink its bathroom policy, which you'll remember was implemented in the face of a public relations crisis after somebody said that they received racist treatment at a Starbucks. So then Starbucks said, all right, anybody can use our bathrooms. They don't just need to be reserved for customers. You don't have to pay, which obviously when you open up the restrooms to non-paying customers, you have paying customers, you have your staff sitting around, often dangerous crises. I actually myself got locked into a Starbucks by the White House. This was in the summer of 2020. I was out covering the protests at BLM Plaza, and a woman started throwing stuff at staff, screaming at them, berating them, and that is not a one-off incident. In fact, we've heard it cited in the reasons that Starbucks workers want to unionize. They told Jacobin that they are forced to double as, quote, untrained social workers. And so it's sort of a tragic reflection on the systemic failure of American society, the most powerful country in the world, the richest country in the world, to deal with crime, to deal with mental illness, to deal with homelessness in a sensible, logical, just way, that we can't even sustain these franchise locations in what were the sort of temples or the avatars of American greatness, our cities. We can't even sustain Starbucks franchises. And then Howard Schultz, and a company that was trying to posture as pro BLM in a million different ways, realizing that this had a negative effect, not just on their sort of bottom line, but on, in general. And so it's amusing and sad to watch them try to deflect blame and act as though they're complete decadent capitalist leftist weird amalgam ideology had nothing to do with it, but at the same time, it's a really sad statement, I think, on our cities. So with that, I'll toss it to the group.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Obviously, Union Station in DC is one of the locations that Starbucks had to close for these reasons, and anyone who's been to Union Station in DC recently knows why. And it's not just Starbucks, right? It's Walgreens, CVS, these kinds of businesses are finding it impossible to operate in the face of rising, as Emily says, essentially required social work, rising homelessness, dealing with people who are absolutely either so high that they're disconnected with reality, or just have very, very serious mental illness problems. This is a complete failure. And it's observably worse because of the policies that are allegedly quote unquote compassionate. And that really drives me crazy. I think Michael Schellenberger does a really good job of laying this out in his book, San Francisco. The very organizations, there are a lot of people actually getting quite rich off of homelessness because there's a ton of money and every single one of those cities going towards that problem. It's just that money is completely ill spent, and it is given to the priorities of essentially woke organizations that purport to speak on behalf of the homeless. And in reality, what the policies boil down to is permitting people to live in open air drug dens and in tent cities in our across the country in our urban areas. And of course, once again, it bears saying, I almost hate to say it because it matters whether it impacts the poorest among us or not. But nevertheless, of course, the people who suffer the most from this are people who cannot remove themselves from it. And what you really have, especially in California, but is really spreading into cities like DC, but a lot of these locations for Starbucks, they're closing in San Francisco, LA, Seattle, Portland, right? And it really, I guess it bears mentioning that we are really kind of transforming ourselves into a sort of Eloy and Morlock situation in a lot of these cities. So for example, in Los Angeles, if you live in downtown, they have a ton of very nice luxury buildings, and those luxury buildings are adding something called amenity decks. And basically the idea is that you can have in your building the equivalent of a CVS where you can pick up any kind of toiletries or any little groceries that you need. They have oftentimes a bar floor where you can socialize and bring people, and they have a garage. So you literally never have to walk the streets of Los Angeles when you're living in one of these luxury buildings. You just go straight down to your car garage, you leave, and you never actually have to interact with the sort of Morlocks running rampant on the streets in downtown Los Angeles. That's not a good model for society. That's almost like going to a sort of a Latin American model where the very wealthy essentially compound themselves off from the larger problems of the society and street crime and homelessness. So that's not a solution going forward, especially for a republic that purports to uphold the principle that all men are created equal, not that we should have two vastly different societies where the rich just completely exit themselves and bar themselves off from the crime and homelessness that affects everybody else. But I'll kick it to Josh and Ben.
Yeah, look, I'll be really quick because we're running short on time with this segment. I'll just say, like, I think what's happening in America's cities, I'll just reiterate a point that we made in a previous podcast, is and should be like a stump speech, very frequent talking points made by Republicans running for office this fall. There aren't that many Republican congressional districts in actual urban areas. I actually live in one, Congresswoman Salazar, who's not a particularly good Republican, to put it mildly, just kind of a rhino if there ever were a rhino. But I actually live in one. But even if there aren't that many Republican-held truly urban congressional districts across the country, there are a lot of suburban congressional districts with the much ballyhooed kind of suburban mom swing vote who kind of frequently kind of go into the cities, or at least want to see their flagship cities be safe, and where Starbucks can basically go and not be hounded by homeless people, right? So this really should be a very popular thing for Republicans to hit on the stump this fall. But I'll transition to Ben just for the sake of time here.
Well, I didn't have Howard Schultz getting mugged by reality on the bingo card this year, but I think this is a demonstration of where we are when Chesa Boudin gets recalled, when Alvin Bragg is under fire in New York. It shows that there are limits, even to the unreasonable radical progressives, when their policies run up with reality. And the reality is that the living standards for everyone degrade. It's bad for both the insane people running wild on the streets, as well as the law-abiding citizens that have to deal with the consequences of it. So I welcome the backlash to the progressives, but I do see that sort of a tale of two societies dystopic picture that Inez is painting continuing to accelerate. This trend of essentially our ruling elites walling themselves off from everyone else. This is, it's not exactly analogous, but the walling off of Capitol Hill after January 6th for months on end, I really think was about separating the ruling class from the ruled and presenting an illustration of that, not because the ruled are really afraid, the ruling class is really afraid of the people they deign to rule, but because they wanted to send that message that they are above everyone else. They ought to be separate and apart from everyone else in society. And so I do think, we are moving towards a model of moats around, or, the modern equivalent of moats around our modern castles. Who wants to live in that society at the end of the day is a question that ought to be put to all of these purported leaders. Who wants to live in a society where it's the rabble and then the elites completely separate and apart from each other? A free republic can't exist for a long time like that.
Yeah, and with that, I think we'll go around and give our final thoughts. I'll kick it off here just to continue the topic of Leo Thomas and transgenderism and the inability of our ruling class, as Ben says, to recognize sex among all the other things that they've separated themselves from the rest of the American people on. I want to make one point that I think does not get made enough, and Matt Walsh, Josh, is one of the few people who actually does make it. We now have a moment where there's a very, very strong majority of people who recognize that biological sex exists and that transgenderism has gone way, way too far. But I do think it's important to take a step back and note that it is ideologically, it follows from the feminist premises that society has long since accepted, right? There isn't a bright biological line between the biological differences that constitute, more upper body strength and different genitals than the biological differences, for example, in male and female brains. You can do a scan of a 6-month fetus in utero, and with 94% accuracy, look at that brain scan and tell whether that is a male or female fetus, right? These differences, these biological differences, they start in the womb and they only get that bigger with time, and they're very real. And once you refuse to acknowledge, as I will say, this is something that Americans as a whole, most of the time we are criticizing the ruling class for very good reason. And I still think that the average American is much more salutary, like admirably salutary compared to the ruling class. But on this, we've long since accepted the premise that basically these differences between men and women ought not to matter very much. They ought not to matter for your career choices. They ought not matter for the way that you build your relationships or the way that we structure society. Those are feminist premises that most of our society has accepted. And there isn't like a bright line stop between that and transgenderism. There is a rebellion for the TERFs, right? There are radical feminists, and we work with them for this Women's Bill of Rights. And we're on the same team on this issue, but nevertheless, I think it's worth pointing out that actually transgenderism does, and the interchangeability of men and women follows from a society that refuses to recognize the distinctions between men and women in a deeper sense, not just in terms of our bits. And that's my final thought, but I'll kick it out to you all for final thoughts.
So I want to talk about foreign policy again. So I want to go back to my segment, but actually kind of just broaden it a little bit here. So from my perspective, I'm pretty sure I've written this or I've said it before. From my perspective, the Trump administration's, if you look at all of its various accomplishments, it was probably disproportionately actually successful in the sphere of foreign policy. On a domestic level, there were any number of successes too, but to be fully candid here, if you look at their 2 main pieces of legislation that passed, kind of a mealy-mouthed tax cut, kind of like a Wall Street Journal, kind of like supply side kind of tax cut, and then like a massive jailbreak, the First Step Act that I personally opposed. But really in the foreign policy space, the Trump administration made some huge accomplishments. Obviously, Trump was the first president since Richard Nixon to totally just try to reset America's relationship with China and all that entailed from a national security perspective, diplomatic perspective, economic perspective, obviously with tariffs. I think if he had gone a second term, he would have probably taken that kind of COVID-centric momentum to really try to kind of reshore, manufacturing in some key supply chains. But obviously, he was deprived of that second term. And then, obviously, to go back to my segment here, the Middle East, it is just remarkable still to me. We're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, which was, the White House ceremony was September of 2020, less than 2 months before the 2020 presidential election. It is really remarkable to me still that no one received the Nobel Peace Prize for the first, systematic peace accords in the Middle East in 25 years. And they got 4 countries in the span of like 3 months. The Sudanese agreement is a little, more legally murky, but at a bare minimum, you still had UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. It was really just incredible stuff. So I say that because when Biden came into office in January 2021, really all he had to do with respect to China, with respect to the Middle East, really also with respect to Russia, by the way. Despite all the hysteria, obviously, Trump took actually a fairly hawkish line on Russia. He had this remarkable speech in Warsaw in the summer of 2017 in kind of Reaganite fashion, where he looked eastward. And, he was actually quite on the policy when it came to things like missile defense, shoring up our Central Eastern European allies. He was actually quite hawkish on Russia. So all that's to say, whether it's Russia, China, Middle East, ISIS, Iran, whatever, all Biden had to do was get in there in January 2021 and not F it up. And, basically everywhere you look, he has managed to do exactly that. We saw what happened with the way that he handled the Afghanistan withdrawal. Obviously, Russia and Ukraine are at war. China has never been more eager to make kind of hegemonic gains in the East and South China Seas. And with respect to the Middle East, now Saudi Arabia, kind of the linchpin of kind of, American Middle East policy, or at least outreach to the Arab world, is kind of falling under the influence of Beijing and their Belt and Road Initiative. And, with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian issue in particular here, the remarkable story of what Trump and Netanyahu accomplished, culminating in the Abraham Accords, was, from my perspective, to once and for all show the folly of the inside-out approach, the so-called inside-out approach to Israeli-Arab reconciliation more broadly, whereby Israel and Palestinians had to make peace, and then Israel would make peace. No, the Trump administration flipped that on its paradigm. They show that you bolster Israel, and by bolstering Israel, then you've got the Emiratis, Bahrainis to come in there, and then once the Palestinians realize the Arab world has shifted on them, then they will kind of come to the negotiating table and beg for scraps once they realize that their claims have been, abandoned by large swaths of the Arab world. So Biden has totally messed that up. He obviously has messed up all these other issues here. So I think it's just worth emphasizing how, just how we know how bad Joe Biden is on domestic policy. We all see the inflation, the gas pump prices, the economy, the immigration at the border, all that stuff. But he has really, really, really messed up the Trump administration's terrific foreign policy accomplishments as well.
Go ahead, Ben. I feel like you're on foreign policy.
Yeah, I'll transition off of it, but briefly, just to Josh's point, I've long argued that national security and foreign policy were where the seminal achievements of the Trump administration lay, not to at all talk down the economic growth and myriad benefits in manufacturing and beyond that transpired during that administration. But I think it's worth noting that precisely because Trump had these myriad achievements, from countering comprehensively communist China to resetting the Middle East and building a bulwark against, again, the kind of Muslim Brotherhood, Shia Khomeinist axis. This is precisely why the national security, intelligence, foreign policy, law enforcement apparatus sprung at Trump, and where all of the assaults came from were precisely in the areas where Trump upset the apple cart, because he challenged their power, privilege, and prerogatives in these areas, actually to the benefit of America's national interest broadly, and consistent with what the American people wanted within these realms. And that is why I believe, I've long held, that the very first assaults on the personnel of the Trump administration were Michael Flynn, National Security Advisor, precisely because it was a non-confirmable position, or a position that did not require confirmation, and he would have disproportionate sway over the president and potentially further threaten the establishment kind of globalist, progressive internationalist agenda. So I think that point is worth making. The president's policies were amazing achievements, incredible, unprecedented achievements in many respects. They happened in spite of the fact that there was the massive onslaught, but there's a reason the massive onslaught came from where it did, which were effectively branches of government unto themselves within the administrative state, the deep state within the administrative state. Just really briefly, I also wanted to say, Inez was talking about kind of the fact that the foreign policy is backwards, essentially, from the perspective of America's national interest. And I think when you look at kind of the progressive agenda writ large, which, even though progressives would say Joe Biden hasn't gone far enough, nevertheless, like, what is the progressive agenda that's being put forth? It would say that hurting the US in terms of our national strength and projection of power and putting our resources to their highest and best use would actually be against our national interest. In other words, hurting America and helping our adversaries is the moral national interest. It would elevate criminals over the law-abiding, the progressive agenda. It would privilege illegal aliens over law-abiding citizens, and of course, punish the border states that reject that policy. And you would invert the sexes. So I think turning society upside down is the progressive agenda, and progressives ought to be asked at every single turn, why do you think your policies make America more peaceful and prosperous when in reality, they're punishing Americans and we see it on our streets every single day? Question ought to be asked, and I think it ought to be framed in that way.
And my final thought kind of goes with that, which is we are unable to function as a society increasingly on very basic terms. And that is extremely worth thinking about because, and by the way, to this question of that Inez raised about how central, I think we all have the same answer to this. The question of, gender identity and versus sex is it on par with these national security conversations? Of course, because this decadence has completely eroded our ability to function in cities and to function in general, right? Like there are communities being torn apart over who's allowed to run in track meets. We can't sustain coffee shops, one of our most successful American companies, in cities because we have just so turned logic on its head in the interest of a sort of decadent postmodern ideology, because we're no longer sort of tethered to something truer, something good, something true, good, and beautiful, right? Like we're no longer tethered to a foundation of rock. We're just on these sort of shifting sands of postmodernity, and that means that increasingly, the Starbucks example. I mean, obviously, I think we all believe it's possible. This is a turning point, and it feels like that in some respect. But if it's not, what we're just going to see is more and more the social fabric tearing in ways that are just as tragic as this example of working class Starbucks employees having to act as untrained social workers in the face of people suffering from the fentanyl crisis, addiction, who have not received treatment, who have been alienated from their communities, attacking them in coffee shops, to the point where an American company like Starbucks can't even function in certain areas of our cities. It's an ongoing tragedy, and hopefully we're at a turning point, but I think we're at least going to see more of this in the near future.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a true, if depressing note to finish this episode on. On behalf of Ben, Emily, and Josh, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman. I'll see you at the next NatCon squad.